Good evening, everyone. We're very pleased to have Professor Peter Barrett, who is going to be one of the respondents this evening, and who has kindly offered to take Patrick Giddy's place. So welcome to another of the IKES launches. And we want to firstly welcome our guest author this evening, Dr. Joseph Noor, who hails to us from Cape Town. He was born in the area of Strand, studied pharmacy at UWC and medical degree at Stellenbosch. He's the CV he sent us was very, very short, and some of us the shortest I think we've had for an author. But that expresses the simple philosophy of life which one can read through some of the writings that he's presented to us so far. His hobbies are running and road running, so my colleague here, Rashad Williams, is going to have some common subject to chat about, who's also an avid runner. On Dr. Noor's left is Yusuf Ismail, the Durban attorney. I've known Yusuf since his first year at varsity at University of Natal, when he was a student enrolling for his BA degree and then furthering on to a law degree. So we're pleased to have Yusuf here, and it was thanks to Yusuf for introducing Dr. Noor to us and proposing that we'd host a Durban launch. And Peter Barrett is in the audience currently, but will join us shortly once Dr. Noor gets into his description. Well, without further ado, Dr. Noor, do you want to come up and speak? Yes, like?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum, shalom, welcome all. It's indeed a pleasure to announce the release of my book entitled Document X, Direct Evidence of God's Existence, which is on the market now. Now, I'm just going to focus on some key aspects of the books because of time constraints. Can you people hear me out there? Okay, all right. Now, why write a book about proving the existence of God? The first reason that inspired me was when I was a youngster, at least when I attended university, I realized there was an inconsistency with some of my traditional beliefs and reality. I couldn't square some of my beliefs with the natural laws of the universe. And I figured that, if God created the universe and He formulated the religion, there shouldn't be any inconsistency. There should be a unified truth. Secondly, there's a small group of people out there, mainly scientists, that occupy high positions at prestigious universities that claim that God does not exist. And if you ask them why, they say, well, there's simply not enough evidence of His existence. My assumption is that if God existed and He desired that people should recognize Him, He would have placed indisputable signs in the heavens so that we would have no problem in accepting His reality. So where were those signs? Where was the evidence? I dedicated my research to discovering those signs. And the third reason what inspired me is that concerns the majority of people like us. Studies indicate that more than 90% of people believe in or subscribe to a supernatural deity. They believe in God. So we should be living in a beautiful, peaceful world. So why is there so much hypocrisy, so much evil in this world? Moreover, why are people afraid of death? I mean, if we believe in a God and death is going to bring us closer to our Creator, why don't we greet death with a smile? How many of us do subscribe to this kind of philosophy? So does this reflect some vulnerability in our belief system, that we profess believe in God, but do we really actually believe in God? Are we convinced of His existence? And these were some of the reasons or challenges that inspired me to write this book. Now, how does one prove the existence of God? surely I can't bring God face to face with you. But most of us will agree if God exists, it's a kind of a being that possesses the qualities of supremacy, uniqueness, perfection, and being all knowledgeable. So if I could prove to you that a being exists that has all-embracing knowledge, then I would have accomplished my task. I can then develop the argument and infer his other attributes. So how does one prove that a God exists which has all-embracing knowledge? Now, one way to do this is through scripture. Now, I've used the Quran. I could have used the Bible. I could have used the Torah. I could have used any of the other major religious books. But because I knew the Quran better, because the Quran has several hundred scientific verses, and my argument is scientifically based, I opted to use the Quran. Now, I think at this stage it's important, especially for our non-Muslim audience, to realize that firstly is that the Quran acknowledges the authenticity of all major religions in its original form. Secondly is that the message that was given to Muhammad in the form of the Quran is essentially the same message that was given to the former prophets. There may have been minor variations depending on cultural needs or intellectual development, but the message fundamentally was the same. So the Quran does not therefore claim to be a new religion. It's in fact a confirmation or the culmination of revelation through the ages. The Quran also encourages its followers to read scriptures of other religions, and so by the same logic, should people of other religious persuasions familiarize themselves with Quranic concepts. Now, it's in this context that people must read my book, not from a restrictive, but from a universal perspective. There's a slight disturbance. Now, let's get back to my original question. How does the Quran prove that God exists? Now, if you study the Quran, you find that one of its miraculous features is that it possesses knowledge of the unknown. It transcends human information. It takes you on this fascinating journey from the beginning of time, the explosive origin of the universe, through the various phases of cosmic evolution till the end of time. It examines the universe, its structure, its functions, its inner working. Now, to describe this journey, to describe the dynamic cosmos, requires intimate knowledge of the various branches of science which underlie these processes. If I can just give you some idea of the concept discussed in the Quran. It speaks about the violent temperatures in the beginning, cosmic expansion, the earlier gaseous phase of the universe, the nature of celestial motion. It gives us a provocative insight into the nature of gravity, discusses Einstein's concept of gravity, the nature of space and time, embryology, features of the DNA molecule, and many more. Now, since such knowledge was non-existent, barely 2 centuries ago, let alone in the 7th century when the Quran appeared, one is driven to invoke some kind of a superior mind to explain these ultra-modern concepts. Secondly, I'm discussing how the Quran, prove the existence of a divine being. Secondly is that the Quran is not silent on any fundamental issue. If you look at, for example, an aspect of cosmic expansion, that is the expansion of the universe, volumes of books have been written on the subject. What the Quran does is it condenses the whole of science into one volume, into this book. Now, to do this, you have to capture the major events of the universe, whether it's cosmological, geological, biological. In other words, only the key scientific principles is being selected. And this in itself is an achievement. And thirdly is that the Quran describes in precise scientific language these concepts. Unlike the prophecies of Nostradamus, which are vague and ill-defined, and which can be interpreted in any way. Moreover, the book also accommodates new concepts, new meanings as scientific knowledge advances. So the book is never outdated. Now, many scholars, including Muslim scholars, maintain that it's a futile exercise, that you cannot, it's a risky business to use science as a means of proving the divinity of the Quran. They say, science depends on theories, and theories change all the time, may even be discarded. Now, this argument is not valid, for a number of reasons. Number one, the Quran does not restrict, when it discusses a specific subject, it doesn't restrict itself to a particular theory, because theories, as pointed out, may change. But what it does, it lays down the general principles of a particular subject. For example, if you look at the origin of life, the Quran gives us the general outline, how life appeared on the earth. It speaks about the formation of the emergence of living matter from non-living matter. There have been tiny beginnings, a gradual, cumulative, step-by-step transformation from simplicity, from simple elements to more complex elements, to more complex stages. Then it looks at other key concepts surrounding also the origin of life, such as the role of water, that life evolved from water, from the extract of clay, not clay itself, but the active principles within the clay, the chemical constituents within the clay. It speaks about the role of energy processes, volcanic eruptions, and transforming mud. So it gives us a general picture of how life emerged. Surely science is continue to making tremendous discoveries in this field in unraveling the secret of the origin of life. But as I said, the Quran accommodates new ideas and new concepts. The rich Arabic meanings of the Quran. That is why one of the reasons the Quran was, it came down in the form of Arabic language, because of the uniqueness of the language, the vast meanings of the Arabic language accommodate new ideas and new concepts. Now, the second reason is why we can use science to prove the divine nature of the Quran is that if we meet another condition, and that is we must distinguish between theory and established science. I mean, it's been established quite clearly that the earth is more or less spherical shape, and that we live in a sun-centered universe, not a sun-centered solar system, but not an earth-centered solar system. So no new theory is ever going to predict a flat, fixed earth or a earth-centered universe. Now, while, it's been, through the ages, the flat fixed earth theory has been promoted in the Middle Ages. The Quran has already spelled out in the 7th century the oval shape of the earth, as well as its axial and orbital rotation, which shows that we can trust its scientific predictions. Now, the third reason is the third condition we must meet in order to make science a credible way of proving the divine nature of the book, is that we mustn't make the Quran subservient to science, but science must be made subservient to the Quran. If you look at the historical record, we find that the theories that at the time contradicted the Quran were all subsequently shown to be incorrect. Now, there are many such examples I'll just give you one example. I mean, the collective wisdom of the scientific community for a couple of thousands of years was that they conceived an eternal static universe. And this idea prevailed right up till the 20th century, when Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe was in a state of violent expansion. A fact announced by the Quran in the 14 centuries ago. So we see therefore that we can use science to prove the divinity of the Quran if we adhere to certain conditions. Now I want to move on to another topic here, is that certain people, are on a mistake-finding mission when they study the Quran, and they find errors in the Quran, scientific errors. And the reason for this is that they don't study the book. Now, in chapter 4, verse 82, the Quran appeals to the human mind. It states that, and I quote in there, I'm going to give you the English translation, of course, will they are the skeptics, not then reflect on this Quran? If it was from any other than God, they would have found that in many a discrepancy. So the Quran, therefore, even divine revelation is not to be accepted unquestioningly or dogmatically. The Quran invites examination. So it is a book that is provable and testable. It adopts the scientific approach. It doesn't expect the reader to just blindly accept what is being stated there, but urges man to study the book in the light of reason, in the light of science, in the light of observations. And this demonstrates the practical approach of the Quran in matters pertaining to faith. Now, I just want to give you one example of how the Quran can be easily be misunderstood. I had a series of discussions with a professor from the States. He's a self-proclaimed atheist. And I informed him that the Quran foreshadows the modern notion of an expanding universe. And his argument was that, this is how he responded. He says that, look, throughout the ages, it was believed that the Milky Way galaxy is all that there is, that nothing lays beyond the Milky Way galaxy except darkness. And so in other words, the Milky Way galaxy comprised the entire universe. So this is how he reasoned. He says when Muhammad said that the universe is expanding, what he actually meant was that the Milky Way galaxy is expanding, which is obviously false because galaxies don't expand. It's the universe that expands. But if he had studied the Quran, he would have found that firstly, the Quran describes the key features of a galaxy. And then it goes on and describes the layout of the universe, that it consists of multiple galaxies and multiple solar systems. So, in other words, the author of the Quran must have been aware, or were aware, that there wasn't just one galaxy, but there were countless galaxies, and these galaxies were flying apart. Now, it's important to realize, talking about the expansion of the universe, when the universe is expanding, it doesn't mean that the galaxies are flying apart in pre-existing space. But what it means that space itself is expanding, pushing the galaxies apart. If you can use the analogy, the most favorite analogy used is that of an inflating balloon with coins stuck onto the surface of the balloon. The balloon represents expanding space and the coins represent galaxies. Now, if you inflate the balloon, it will swell up or inflate, and what will happen? The coins will be pushed apart. So in other words, it is not the galaxies that are moving through space, but it's space itself that is expanding, so that the galaxy expands with space. And the Quran makes this distinction. Not only does it tell us that the universe is expanding, but tell us in another verse, 86:11, which states, by the heavenly space which is expanding and curving. Now here the Quran relates the expanding and the curved nature of space. So the moral of the story is that if you want to criticize the Quran, first make sure that you study the book properly. In conclusion, through the years I've written the book, it took me about 25 years. I've discovered a series of amazing parallels between modern science and the Quran. The question is that how is it possible that a single soul in the 7th century, Muhammad, which critics claim fabricated the Quran, could venture into the then unknown intricacies of modern cosmology, astronomy, genetics, embryology. I mean, the chances of him making 100% of these predictions with 100% accuracy is staggeringly improbable. In fact, I think it's a flat zero. On the other hand, the chances of making absurd predictions is overwhelming. So the supreme test, the challenge would be to test the Quran from a modern perspective and see if it withstands the rigors of the modern scientific method. I have applied this test myself several times, and each time the Quran has emerged triumphantly. So the wealth of data contained in the Quran has no human explanation on the time of the count, on the count of the time interval during which these truths were formulated. So weighing up the evidence, there remains only one explanation consistent with the facts. And that is, Muhammad was advised by some superior intellect, and God therefore exists. I thank you for your time.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to have a microphone because my voice is actually quite soft, and I've been coughing a lot as well. I hope that won't get in the way. I'm standing in for Patrick Giddy, very much at the last moment, and I'm not sure that I can give a really coherent response. I do, first of all, admire Joseph Noura for the sort of the idea, the project that he's carried through in many ways very successfully. As Patrick Giddies said, the scientific aspect is very remarkable. It's one of the best accounts he's had of the main forces of the universe. And so I think what I can try to do is first give a couple of resources one could go to and point out what a sort of unusual way that Joseph has taken in actually proving the existence of God by the route of trying to show the accuracy scientifically of the Quran. Now he's probably in a very small minority, I imagine, in Islam in choosing that way. I mean, one of the resources that I could turn to is a book that's used very much as a textbook in England called God, Humanity and the Cosmos. It's quite a good thick textbook with questions in it and so on by several authors. One of them is a Michael Negus, who I think was a biologist, but also trained in computer science and Islamic studies. And he wrote a chapter which gives a good overview. And he quotes towards the end a Muslim scholar called Al-Hashimi, writing in 1981, "There can be no doubt that the Quran is not a book of psychological, scientific, geographical, or cosmic theory. It is essentially a book of guidance." Now, I think that's a key point. And there are creationists on the Christian side who want to use the Bible as a book of science, as a book of cosmic theory. There's some very hard-line ones there. And it's not only the creationists of this century. If I go back to a position taken by a leading Anglican scholar in the middle of the 18th century, very conservative about Scripture, and he rejected Darwin's theory vehemently as contrary to Scripture, and his way of putting it was like this: The Bible is none other than the voice of him that sitteth on the throne. Every book of it, every chapter of it, every verse of it, every word of it, every syllable of it, where are we to stop? Every letter of it is the direct utterance of the Most High. The Bible is none other than the Word of God, not some part of it more, nor some part of it less, but all alike, the utterance of him who sitteth upon the throne, faultless, unerring, supreme. Now, there may be creationists and others in both religions who would take that sort of view. I think where I come in, I'll just add one other thing that Patrick said in respect of Joseph's work. Having liked the science enormously, he as a philosopher would say he felt it needed some philosophical underpinning. That is, how do we know? That's the title of a conference I went to by the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology. How do we actually know things? And that raises the question of how human beings, how the brain works to relate to what's out there. There's a very fine work by a certain Stephen Mython at the University of Reading in England called The Prehistory of the Mind. And he, perhaps in a fairly inspired way, has put together, it must be very difficult to try to know how the early hominids began to think. What were their cognitive processes like? He concluded that in the early hominids, there were 3 separate intelligences in the brain. One for dealing with the world of nature around them, one for dealing socially with their fellow beings, and another to do with technical aspects. But as the brain developed, this is the whole business of evolution that Joseph has talked about. He talks about the development of consciousness as the species developed, and there came a time of what they called cognitive fluidity. The 3 separate ways of thinking in the brain began to merge together and give it much more subtlety, and the ability eventually to begin to think abstractly and symbolically, and to use metaphor and so on, and to develop language. And so that is a very powerful way that we as human beings have to relate to our world in a way far beyond one imagines our fellow hominids, say the chimpanzee. And I picked out one thing on that aspect of the book. I just managed to look for a few minutes into the latter part, and apart from his reference to the God spot in the human brain, which I think, I imagine many people in the neurosciences would be a bit skeptical about, but what was I going to say? Yes, I think where he comes to a point called the soulless man. Man does not have a soul as a separate entity in the body. It seems to be not essential, and maybe he can pick up on that point. I think in the kind of thinking that I've been in touch with, the soul is not something specially breathed in, as perhaps suggested in biblical language, but rather that it's simply the outcome of this very powerful cognitive ability to imagine. The gift of imagination, for some writers, is what gives us human beings, makes us in the image of God, imago Dei. It's that gift, because if you look into the nature of God as evidenced around us in the world, in the creation, it seems that there's a very great imaginative aspect as to the divine attribute. And that's one of the great gifts we have. And it's because we have this power to imagine and to therefore to think deeply into the other person's position that we have the power to relate. And so in this terminology, the soul is that which enables me, it's the real me, the heart of me, that enables me to relate to other such me's. I think another thing I could mention is